that person was carrying a child.
And you say a person, male or female?
Not a male.
So I went into our bedroom and she wasn't there. And that was the first time really that the panic hit. And I just ran back into her bedroom, and literally at that point, the curtains, which were closed, just kind of flew open.
On May 3rd, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A in Praia da Luz, Portugal. That night, Jane Tanner, a friend dining with the McCanns, claims she saw a man carrying a barefoot child in light-colored pajamas at 9:15 p.m. Her account quickly became the cornerstone of the abduction theory. But here's the shocking part: no one else saw him. Not Jerry McCann, who stood just meters away, nor Jez Wilkins, who spoke with him on the same street. Only Jane. Later, police identified the man as an innocent tourist with his own daughter. If Tanner was wrong, her words didn't reveal the truth. They may have invented it. On the night of May 3, 2007, the disappearance of 3-year-old Madeleine McCann transformed a family holiday in Praia da Luz, Portugal, into one of the most notorious mysteries of the 21st century. The McCanns, Kate and Jerry, both doctors from the United Kingdom, had traveled with their 3 children and a group of friends to the Ocean Club Resort. What should have been an ordinary evening ended with headlines that shook the world. Madeleine was missing from apartment 5A, a small ground floor unit near the pool, and from that moment, every detail of the evening became a subject of scrutiny. To understand the centrality of Jane Tanner in this case, one must first look at the circle of friends, known collectively as the Tapas Seven. This group of British holidaymakers included couples and families with young children, many of whom had formed bonds through shared vacations. On the night in question, they dined together at the Tapas Bar, a restaurant within the resort complex. The arrangement was convenient but controversial. Each couple left their children asleep in nearby apartments and took turns checking on them throughout the evening. Jane Tanner was one of those friends. She attended dinner with her partner, Dr. Russell O'Brien, and their 2 young daughters, who slept in a ground floor apartment not far from the McCanns. Within this circle, Tanner held no official responsibility beyond being another parent, another vacationer. Yet by the end of the night, her name would be etched into the official record as the only witness to a potential abductor. The reason Tanner's role became so critical lies in the nature of her claim. At approximately 9:15 p.m., she left the table to check on her children. As she walked along the narrow street near apartment 5A, she later told police she saw a man crossing the road, holding a small child dressed in light-colored pajamas, barefoot, her limbs hanging loosely. This, she suggested, could have been Madeleine. No other member of the Tapas group, no resort staff, and no passing resident reported seeing such a figure at that time. Her account alone carried the weight of describing the moment Madeleine may have been carried out of the resort and into the night. Why did Tanner's statement rise above all others? Because the case itself lacked clear physical evidence. There were no broken locks, no forced shutters, no ransom notes. The apartment showed no signs of violent entry. In such an environment, where material clues were scarce, an eyewitness account became disproportionately powerful. Tanner's words offered investigators and the public something tangible, an image of a child in danger, taken by an unknown man. Her description provided both narrative structure and emotional resonance. Without her, the notion of abduction would have rested only on Kate McCann's cry of, "They've taken her." A statement that many might have dismissed as panic. Tanner gave that cry a visual companion. The fact that she was part of the Tapas Seven also influenced how her testimony was received. As a friend of the McCanns, she was close enough to understand the evening's dynamics, but not a parent directly implicated in the disappearance. This dual position, connected yet slightly apart, granted her words an air of credibility. She was seen as a sympathetic participant rather than a central figure. It was easier for the media, and initially for investigators, to accept that she might have glimpsed the truth. Yet her uniqueness also created problems. Tanner was the only one who saw this supposed abductor. At roughly the same time she placed her sighting, Jerry McCann was returning from a check on his children and had stopped to chat with another guest, Jez Wilkins, just meters from the very spot Tanner described. Neither Jerry nor Wilkins saw a man carrying a child. This contradiction placed Tanner in an awkward position. Was she the only attentive observer in that moment, or had she misinterpreted, or even imagined, what she saw? When compared to the other members of the Tapas Seven, Tanner's statement stands apart. Matthew Oldfield, who checked the McCann children at 9:30, admitted he never looked closely enough to confirm Madeleine's presence. Russell O'Brien, Tanner's partner, was occupied with one of their own children who was unwell. Other members gave routine descriptions of dinner, drinks, and casual conversation. Only Tanner introduced a new and dramatic element, a stranger in the night carrying away a child. In effect, her testimony alone injected the word abduction into the official narrative. This exclusivity is precisely why her account became the focal point of debate. Supporters of the abduction theory viewed her as the key witness, the person who glimpsed the crime in progress. Skeptics, however, regarded her as the weakest link, pointing out that without corroboration, her words were just that, words. The absence of any supporting testimony raised the unsettling possibility that the cornerstone of the entire theory rested on a single, unstable foundation. To appreciate the significance of Tanner's role, it helps to consider how the case might have unfolded without her. If no one had claimed to see a man with a child, investigators would have faced a disappearance, marked only by an open window, a missing girl, and two distressed parents. Theories might have leaned toward an accident, a wandering child, or a domestic tragedy concealed inside the apartment. Instead, Tanner's description redirected attention outward, toward the idea of an intruder. This shift shaped not only the investigation, but also the global media narrative, ensuring that the case was understood first and foremost as a kidnapping. Over time, doubts about Tanner's sighting would grow. Yet in the immediate aftermath of May 3, her voice was elevated above others. She was not the first to raise the alarm, nor the last to give a statement, but she was the only one who provided the missing image. A man carrying Madeleine into the darkness. It was a story detail powerful enough to overshadow every other account from that night. In conclusion, Jane Tanner's role in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann cannot be separated from the larger context of May 3, 2007. She was part of the Tapas Seven, a holiday companion and friend, yet her statement lifted her from background figure to pivotal witness. Her testimony became the central thread in the abduction narrative, primarily because no one else claimed to see what she did. By comparing her to other witnesses, it is clear that she stood alone, for better or worse, as the only person to describe an abductor in action. Whether that description reflected reality or misperception remains the central question, but its impact on the case is undeniable. The evening of May 3, 2007, began like any other holiday night for the McCanns and their friends. Around 7 p.m., Kate and Jerry McCann put their 3 children to bed in apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz. Madeleine, just 3 years old, was dressed in her pink and white pajamas, while her younger siblings, Sean and Emily, were placed in their cots. The parents locked the front door, but deliberately left the back patio sliding door unlocked, believing it would make it easier to carry out the system of checking on the children that they and their friends had established. This decision, simple in the moment, would later be dissected endlessly by police, journalists, and the public. By 8:30 p.m., the adults gathered at the Tapas Bar, a restaurant within the resort complex. They became known later as the Tapas Seven, a group of friends and fellow parents who chose to leave their children asleep in nearby apartments while they ate together. To reassure themselves that the children were safe, they created a rotation system. Every 20 or 30 minutes, one of the adults would leave the table and quietly check on the sleeping children. The restaurant was only about 55 meters from the McCann's apartment, but the road was not a direct line of sight. Trees, walls, and garden paths meant that any parent leaving dinner would have to walk around to reach the doors. At about 9 p.m., Jerry McCann excused himself to make his first check. He walked back to apartment 5A, entered, and later reported that all 3 children were asleep. He noticed that the bedroom door was more ajar than before, but he thought little of it. After using the bathroom, he adjusted the door and left the apartment. On his way back, he encountered another guest, Jeremy, Jez, Wilkins, who was out walking with his own child. Jerry and Wilkins stopped on the street, just outside the apartment block, and began talking. Their conversation would last for several minutes. It was during this exact window, around 9:10 to 9:15 p.m., that Jane Tanner left the Tapas bar. She had 2 young daughters of her own sleeping nearby, and it was her turn to check on them. Tanner walked up the narrow street toward the apartments, passing on the opposite side of the road from Jerry and Jez, who were still chatting. According to her later statement, it was at this moment that she saw something unusual: a man walking quickly across the street, holding a small child. She recalled that the child had bare feet and was wearing pale pajamas, her body lying limply in the man's arms as though asleep. The sight lasted only seconds as she continued on her way. The importance of Tanner's account lies in its timing. Jerry had just checked the McCann children at 9:05 and insisted Madeleine was asleep. Kate would not return to the apartment until 10 p.m., when she found her daughter gone. Tanner's sighting at 9:15 offered a possible explanation of what had happened in the meantime. To the police, the media, and eventually the public, it looked like the missing link, Madeleine alive at 9:05, an unknown man carrying a child at 9:15, and a disappearance discovered by 10. Yet this pivotal observation was also filled with contradictions. The most obvious was that Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins, standing only a few meters from where Tanner placed her sighting, saw nothing. They were facing the same street, engaged in conversation, and their lines of sight should have overlapped with hers. Neither man later recalled a figure carrying a child at that moment. For investigators, this discrepancy raised immediate questions about visibility, perception, and reliability. Meanwhile, back at the Tapas bar, Kate McCann remained at the table with the rest of the group, unaware that her daughter's fate was already being debated in fragments of testimony. She would not leave to perform her own check until the top of the next hour. The group's rotation system, casual and poorly coordinated, meant that each parent operated independently, without comparing notes or synchronizing times. This looseness created opportunities for confusion later, when police tried to reconstruct exact movements. Pinpointing Tanner's sighting to a precise minute is possible only because of the overlap with Jerry's check and his meeting with Wilkins. If Jerry entered the apartment at 9:05, used the bathroom, and then spent about 5 minutes talking outside, he would still have been in place by 9:10. Tanner left the restaurant around that time, walked up the street, and passed them on the opposite side. That is when she later said she noticed the man with the child. The implication is that the abductor, if he existed, must have slipped by within a 2 or 3 minute window while Jerry was preoccupied. For Tanner, it was a fleeting moment, but for the case it became monumental. She did not stop or confront the figure, nor did she mention the sighting immediately when she returned to the restaurant. Only later, after the alarm was raised at 10 p.m., did her observation become central to the story. But in that moment, an ordinary walk along a narrow road between apartments and a restaurant, she became the sole person to claim she saw Madeleine being carried away. The timeline of that night, reconstructed through countless interviews, statements, and media reports, narrows into this one critical passage of time between 9 and 10 p.m. The children were put to bed at 7, dinner began at 8:30, Jerry checked at 9:05, Tanner walked past at 9:15, Oldfield glanced in at 9:30, and Kate discovered Madeleine gone at 10. Within that hour, the case shifted from routine holiday to global mystery, and at the heart of it all, Jane Tanner's position stands out as unique. She was neither a parent of the missing child nor a distant observer. She was a friend in the group who happened to step out at the right, or the wrong, moment. Her claim that she saw a man carrying a child across the street remains the only eyewitness description of an abduction in progress. Whether her memory was accurate, mistaken, or influenced by later events remains debated. But in the fragile timeline of May 3, her words filled the gap between certainty and uncertainty. Jerry's calm check at 9:05 and Kate's frantic discovery at 10 would never have been connected without her. In those few seconds on a quiet street in Praia da Luz, Jane Tanner provided the testimony that defined the case. When investigators first began collecting statements in the immediate aftermath of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, Jane Tanner's account stood out not for its urgency, but for its peculiarity. She did not run into the Tapas bar at 9:15 shouting that she had just seen someone carrying a child. She did not interrupt Jerry's conversation outside the apartment to say that something unusual had happened on the same street. Instead, her words came later, woven into the confusion that followed Kate McCann's discovery at 10 p.m. and the frantic hours afterward. This delay would become one of the most troubling aspects of her testimony, raising questions about how and why her sighting entered the official record only after the crisis had already exploded. According to her first formal statement, Tanner described the figure she saw in remarkably simple terms. The man, she said, was of medium build, dressed in dark clothing, walking quickly across the narrow street. He was carrying a child in his arms. The child, small in stature and barefoot, wore light-colored pajamas. Tanner recalled that the child's body seemed limp, as though asleep or unconscious, her arms and legs hanging loosely. The image was fleeting. She did not stop. She did not stare. She did not exchange words. It was a glance, a passing impression caught in the dim light of a Portuguese evening. The significance of these details lies not only in what she saw, but in what she didn't. She did not describe the child's face. She could not say whether the figure was male or female with certainty, though she thought the build was masculine. The pajamas, she later said, resembled those Madeleine was known to be wearing, pale with a hint of color. But this too was vague and came only when prompted. The lack of precision was understandable in one sense. Eyewitness memory is fragile, and nighttime sightings are rarely clear, but troubling in another. For what was presented as the abduction of a child, the testimony seemed strangely muted. Equally striking was Tanner's attitude in the immediate hours. She did not treat her observation as a red flag. When she returned to the restaurant after checking on her own daughters, she mentioned nothing to the group about seeing a man with a child. To her, in that moment, it was not cause for alarm. Only after Kate returned to apartment 5A at 10 p.m., screamed that Madeleine was gone, and chaos swept through the resort did Tanner's recollection surface. Suddenly, what had seemed like an incidental sighting now carried enormous weight. This sequence, an ordinary sight at 9:15 becoming a crucial clue only after 10, created a structural weakness in her testimony. If she had spoken earlier, the group might have raised an alarm sooner, perhaps even intercepted the man she described. But because she said nothing until later, her account felt retrofitted, as if layered on top of events already unfolding. Critics have argued that this allowed suggestion and hindsight to shape her words. She now had the context of a missing child, and her memory may have adjusted unconsciously to fit that narrative. The timing also raised questions for investigators. Why did Tanner not recognize the significance of what she saw at once? One explanation is that in a holiday setting, with families strolling back and forth from dinner, seeing a man carry a child did not appear strange. She may have assumed it was another parent bringing a sleepy toddler home. The cool evening air and casual resort atmosphere could have made such a sight easy to dismiss. Another explanation is social. She may not have wanted to interrupt Jerry and Jez's conversation with something that felt trivial. Only in hindsight, when the disappearance became clear, did the memory transform from mundane to extraordinary. Her first statements to Portuguese police reflected this hesitancy. Her words were tentative, couched in uncertainty. She did not insist. She did not demand action. Instead, she offered her recollection quietly, almost cautiously, as though unsure of its importance. For investigators, this raised doubts about whether she truly saw what she later claimed or whether her memory had been reconstructed under pressure. There is also the question of influence. By the time Tanner gave her statement, the group had already been exposed to Kate's exclamation, "They've taken her," and to the spreading panic of a missing child. Within hours, family and friends back in the UK were telling media outlets that the shutters of the apartment had been broken open. Such details, many of which proved inaccurate, were circulating among the group. In this atmosphere of confusion, Tanner's sighting took on a life of its own. quickly interpreted as proof of the abduction story. Yet the fact that it had not been shared immediately at 9:15 made it vulnerable to accusations that it was shaped by groupthink and fear, rather than raw memory. Another layer of complexity comes from how Tanner's description evolved in the days that followed. Her earliest account was minimal: a man, dark clothes, a child in pajamas. Later, more details appeared: the child's size, the pattern of the pajamas, the way the man held her. Investigators wondered whether these additions reflected genuine memory surfacing under questioning, or whether they were influenced by knowledge of what Madeleine had been wearing. The timing of when certain details emerged made it difficult to separate authentic recollection from retrospective association. In the broader narrative of May 3, Tanner's delayed statement filled a critical gap. Jerry's check at 9:05 suggested Madeleine was safe, Kate's discovery at 10 showed she was missing, and Tanner's sighting at 9:15 offered a bridge between the two. Without her, the timeline would lack an external figure, leaving only speculation. With her, the abduction story gained a visual anchor. Yet the very fact that she did not share this observation until after the alarm had been raised undermined its reliability. In conclusion, Jane Tanner's initial testimony was both simple and profound. She did not react at the time because she did not view it as alarming. The reasons for this delay may lie in context, psychology, or social dynamics, but the effect was the same. Her account entered the record late, and with it came questions about accuracy and influence. For investigators and the public alike, the timing of her words proved as significant as their content. It left open the possibility that Tanner had indeed glimpsed the truth, or that she had unknowingly created it. When the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária, often referred to simply as the PJ, took charge of the Madeleine McCann investigation, they were immediately faced with a storm of conflicting narratives. On one side stood the McCanns and their friends, insisting Madeleine had been abducted. On the other stood the Baron Apartment 5A, with no signs of forced entry and little physical evidence to support the claim. Into this tension stepped Jane Tanner's testimony, the vivid account of a man carrying a child at 9:15 p.m. For the British media and for supporters of the McCanns, Tanner's sighting seemed like the crucial clue. For the PJ, however, it quickly became one of the most problematic pieces of the puzzle. Chief Inspector Goncalo Amaral, the lead investigator in those early months, would later make clear his doubts. Amaral was a seasoned officer, with decades of experience in the Algarve handling violent crime and organized trafficking cases. He approached the McCann case with the instincts of someone who had seen how appearances can mislead and how narratives can be constructed to fit needs. To Amaral, the story of a stranger breaking into an apartment, silently removing a child, and slipping past witnesses was possible, but far from convincing. Tanner's sighting, rather than clarifying, seemed to complicate the picture. The PJ's skepticism rested first on the lack of corroboration. Tanner claimed to have seen the man at 9:15, passing just meters away from where Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins were standing in conversation. Both men later confirmed their discussion, and both said they saw nothing unusual. For Amaral, this was not a minor oversight. Two adults standing at that exact spot should have noticed a man carrying a barefoot child across the street. The fact that they did not raised immediate doubts about whether Tanner had truly seen what she later described. Compounding this problem was Tanner's own delay in reporting her sighting. She did not rush back to the Tapas bar at 9:15 to announce that she had just witnessed something strange. She only spoke of it after 10 p.m. For the PJ, this timing was suspicious. It suggested that Tanner's memory could have been shaped by the narrative already emerging among the group. Instead of an independent observation, it might have been a retrospective contribution designed, consciously or unconsciously, to support the abduction theory. Amaral and his team also noted how Tanner's description evolved. In her first statement, she spoke vaguely of a man in dark clothes carrying a child in pale pajamas. Later, her account gained more detail, particularly about the child's clothing, aligning it more closely with what Madeleine had been wearing. To the PJ, this shift looked less like a memory becoming clearer and more like a memory being adjusted to fit the facts as they became known. Investigators were well aware of the psychological phenomenon where witnesses unconsciously adapt their recollections to match the dominant narrative. In this case, the narrative was being heavily pushed by the McCanns and the British press. The lack of physical evidence further undermined Tanner's claim. If a man had carried a child out of apartment 5A at 9:15, investigators expected to find some trace, footprints in the garden, disturbed shutters, fibers or fingerprints on the window. Instead, forensic teams found nothing. The shutters had not been forced. The only fingerprints on the window belonged to Kate McCann herself. No independent witness reported seeing a stranger hurrying away with a child. For Amaral's team, the absence of corroborating evidence was telling. An abduction of this kind would have been bold and risky, yet the scene offered no supporting proof. The PJ also considered alternative explanations. Could Tanner have seen another tourist carrying his own child? Could she have misinterpreted what was, in reality, an ordinary parental act? These possibilities gained traction as the investigation unfolded. Months later, detectives identified a British holidaymaker who admitted he had been carrying his daughter from a nearby night crèche around the same time. This man's description matched aspects of Tanner's sighting, leading Portuguese police to conclude that her account may have had nothing to do with Madeleine at all. For Amaral, the implications were clear. If Tanner had indeed seen another tourist, then her testimony had acted as a red herring, a distraction pulling attention away from other, more plausible explanations. In his later book Maddie, The Truth of the Lie, Amaral was explicit. He believed the McCanns had constructed an abduction story to cover up an accident inside the apartment. And Tanner's sighting had been absorbed into that story, either through manipulation or misunderstanding. From this perspective, the vivid image of a man carrying a child at 9:15 was not the key to solving the case, but a narrative device that diverted resources and shaped public perception. The PJ's doubts were not limited to Amaral himself. Within the investigative team, there was a strong consensus that Tanner's testimony lacked reliability. Officers pointed to inconsistencies between her account and those of her friends, contradictions in timing, and the implausibility of an abductor choosing that exact moment, when Jerry was inside the apartment and then chatting outside, to make his escape. Experienced investigators found it difficult to believe that a kidnapper would take such a risk. Moreover, the Portuguese police were aware of the media environment surrounding the case. British tabloids seized on Tanner's sighting as proof of abduction, splashing it across front pages and portraying it as a dramatic breakthrough. For the PJ, this was frustrating. They saw how the press exaggerated her words, reinforcing a narrative that was not supported by the physical evidence. The more the story of the man with the child circulated in the media, the harder it became to question it without appearing dismissive of the McCann's plight. Yet behind closed doors, investigators treated the sighting with deep caution. Ultimately, the PJ reached a reluctant conclusion. While they could not prove Tanner was lying, they did not find her testimony trustworthy enough to serve as a cornerstone of the case. In their view, it was either an innocent misinterpretation or a manipulated contribution shaped by group dynamics. Either way, it did not provide the clear evidence of abduction that the McCanns claimed. Instead, it distracted from other lines of inquiry, particularly the possibility of an accidental death inside the apartment. This conclusion had significant consequences. It widened the gap between the Portuguese police and the British authorities, who continued to promote Tanner's sighting as a critical piece of the puzzle. It also deepened the divide between Amaral and the McCanns, leading eventually to lawsuits and bitter public disputes. To the PJ, Tanner's sighting symbolized the larger problem of the case, a reliance on inconsistent testimony rather than hard evidence, a narrative driven more by perception than by proof. In retrospect, the PJ's skepticism seems justified. Years later, Scotland Yard acknowledged that Tanner's sighting likely referred to the unrelated tourist carrying his own daughter. This confirmation supported what Amaral had argued from the beginning, that her account, while sincere, had misled the investigation. For the PJ, it was a classic red herring, compelling enough to capture attention, but ultimately irrelevant to the truth of what happened to Madeleine. In the end, Jane Tanner's testimony illustrates both the power and the peril of eyewitness accounts. For the Portuguese police, it became an example of how a single statement, repeated and amplified, can dominate an investigation while offering little real substance. To Amaral and his team, Tanner did not provide the answer to the mystery. Instead, she provided a distraction, one that allowed the abduction story to flourish, even as the evidence pointed elsewhere. From the very beginning, the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance was shaped not only by physical evidence, but by the stories told about that night. Among these stories, Jane Tanner's sighting became the central plank of what quickly came to be known as the abduction theory. Without her testimony, the disappearance might have been framed in far more ambiguous terms. The impact of her words on the official storyline cannot be overstated. They transformed a vague sense of loss into a plot with sequence, characters, and movement. The structure was simple but persuasive. Jerry McCann reported seeing Madeleine safe in bed at 9:05, Jane Tanner reported seeing a man carrying a child at 9:15, and Kate McCann discovered her daughter missing at 10. These three anchors created a timeline that appeared coherent and compelling. In the absence of forensic proof, this sequence provided the scaffolding on which the case was built. It is precisely this sequence that gave her testimony its power. By bridging the gap between Jerry's check and Kate's discovery, Tanner supplied the missing middle act of a three-part drama. To the public, it seemed logical. A parent verified the child was present, a friend glimpsed a figure leaving, and then the child was gone. For investigators under pressure, it offered a way to impose order on what might otherwise have remained chaotic. Yet the neatness of this arc was also its weakness. Complex events rarely unfold with such tidy intervals. Tanner's sighting, slotted conveniently into the space between 9:05 and 10, risked looking less like reality and more like a storyline. The importance of this timeline was that it appeared to lock in the time of the alleged abduction. By placing the act at roughly 9:15, it allowed police, media, and the public to narrow their focus. Everything else could then be measured against it: who was present, who was absent, what could have been seen or heard. This lock made the case easier to discuss, but more difficult to challenge. If her sighting was accepted as accurate, then speculation about earlier or later events could be dismissed as irrelevant. The disappearance became a problem of minutes, not hours, and those minutes belonged to Tanner's account. For supporters of the abduction theory, this timeline was invaluable. It implied an intruder had slipped in and out with uncanny precision, just after a parent checked, and just before another parent discovered the loss. For critics, it looked too convenient. If Madeleine's fate had in fact been sealed earlier in the evening, Tanner's words provided a way to shift suspicion away from that possibility. By asserting that she saw the child being carried away alive at 9:15, her testimony implicitly supported the idea that the McCanns could not have been involved in an earlier tragedy. The timeline itself acted as an alibi. Whether intentional or not, this functioned as a kind of shield for Jerry McCann in particular. His statement that he saw Madeleine safe at 9:05 could have been undermined if doubts arose about what he actually observed in the dim bedroom. But with Tanner placing Madeleine alive and in the arms of another person 10 minutes later, Jerry's role was reinforced as the last parent to see her unharmed. In this way, her account not only created an abduction narrative, but also stabilized the parent's credibility within it. The strategic value of this alignment was enormous. For the McCanns, facing immediate scrutiny from police and the press, Tanner's words provided external validation of their claim that Madeleine had been taken. They did not have to stand alone as the only voices insisting on abduction. They could point to their friend's testimony as independent corroboration. Even if her account was vague, its mere existence allowed them to say, "Someone else saw the abductor." This dynamic, whether orchestrated or accidental, altered the balance of suspicion. For investigators, however, this interlocking timeline became a double-edged sword. On one side, it gave structure to their inquiries, a sequence to test and compare. On the other, it risked narrowing their vision prematurely. Once the abduction theory took hold, reinforced by Tanner's testimony, alternative scenarios were sidelined. Questions about whether Madeleine could have died earlier, or whether events inside the apartment might explain her disappearance, were pushed aside in favor of hunting for the man she claimed to see. In this way, her testimony shaped not only the narrative, but also the investigative priorities. What makes this situation even more complex is the possibility that Tanner herself did not realize the strategic weight her words carried. From her perspective, she was recounting something she remembered from her walk that night. But once those words entered the official timeline, they became far more than a personal recollection. They became the keystone in the construction of an entire theory. In effect, she had supplied the missing link that turned speculation into apparent certainty. Whether consciously or unconsciously, her account provided a shield for the McCanns and redirected investigative focus toward an external intruder. The implications of this dynamic continue to echo. To this day, when people recall the case, they often imagine the timeline in exactly these terms: safe at 9:05, carried off at 9:15, gone by 10. This sequence has become embedded in public memory, largely because of Tanner's words. Without them, the evening might have remained a blur of checks, conversations, and confusion. With them, it became a story with beginning, middle, and end. In re-examining Jane Tanner's role, some investigators and commentators have advanced a far more unsettling hypothesis. What if her testimony was not a spontaneous recollection, but part of a pre-arranged narrative designed to protect the McCanns from suspicion? This theory rests on the possibility that Madeleine's disappearance was not the result of a stranger's abduction, but of a tragic accident inside apartment 5A, an accident the parents and their friends sought to conceal. In such a scenario, Tanner's sighting becomes not a coincidence, but a calculated insertion into the timeline, carefully tailored to construct an abduction story from thin air. The idea begins with the uncanny neatness of her account. At precisely 9:15, she claimed to have seen a man carrying a child away from the McCann's apartment. This slotted perfectly into the broader timeline. Jerry checked the children at 9:05. Kate would later discover Madeleine missing at 10, and Tanner's sighting supplied the missing middle. The sequence is so convenient that it reads like a scripted drama rather than the chaotic reality of a crime scene. In this view, Tanner was not simply relaying what she saw but performing a role, providing the crucial piece of evidence that locked the story into place. If one entertains the possibility of a domestic accident, perhaps a fall, a medical crisis, or something else entirely, the motivation for such a script becomes clear. For the McCanns, the consequences of admitting such an event would have been devastating, both personally and professionally. As medical professionals and parents, they would have faced legal charges, professional ruin, and public condemnation. For their friends, bound by loyalty and perhaps by fear of implication, the instinct to shield them might have outweighed the instinct to speak the truth. In this atmosphere, a collective decision could have been made to build an alternative narrative, one that shifted blame onto an external villain. Tanner's testimony was the linchpin of this construction. Without her, the abduction theory lacked a witness. The child would have vanished into a void of uncertainty, leaving open the possibility of an accident or parental involvement. With her, the void was filled with an abductor. She supplied the image, the man, the child, the pajamas, that transformed suspicion into story. It is difficult to overstate how vital this was. In criminal investigations, eyewitness testimony carries enormous weight. Even vague recollections are treated as anchors. Tanner's words, therefore, gave the group's version of events both legitimacy and momentum. The possibility that her statement was shaped in advance is reinforced by how closely the other members of the Tapas Seven seemed to align with her account. Each of them, when questioned, provided details that supported the abduction narrative. Whether by emphasizing the group's regular checks on the children, or by underlining how normal the evening appeared until the alarm was raised. The uniformity of their stories has been interpreted by some as evidence of rehearsal. Real memories, after all, tend to diverge in small but telling ways. When everyone's version fits too neatly, suspicion arises that the story has been harmonized. Critics point out that such harmonization may have occurred quickly, in the frantic minutes after Kate shouted, "They've taken her." At that moment, the group would have been confronted with a crisis, a child gone, police to be called, questions to be answered. If an accident had already taken place earlier that evening, this would have been the point at which their cover story had to solidify. Tanner's memory, introduced only after the alarm, could have been shaped not by shock, but by calculation. She may have known exactly what role she had to place Madeleine outside the apartment at 9:15, alive, in the arms of a phantom abductor. The logic of this hypothesis extends beyond Tanner herself. If the group agreed to protect the McCanns, each member would have had a part to play. Some emphasized their routine checks to suggest vigilance, others confirmed the parents' movements, and Tanner alone provided the crucial external sighting. Together, their testimonies interlocked like pieces of a puzzle, creating a narrative so coherent that it resisted alternative explanations. To investigators inclined to skepticism, this coherence looked less like truth and more like choreography. From this perspective, the case takes on the dimensions of a staged performance. The Tapas Seven are not simply witnesses but actors, each delivering lines that support the central plot. Tanner's role is that of the key witness, the one who sees the villain. Her account becomes the dramatic turning point of the play, transforming a missing child into a kidnapping. Yet, like any script, its strength lies not in authenticity, but in consistency. What holds it together is not reality, but agreement. The weaknesses in Tanner's testimony, her delay in reporting, the absence of corroborating witnesses, the shifting details, can all be reinterpreted under this hypothesis. They are not signs of a faulty memory, but of a hastily assembled story. She may have hesitated to speak at first, because she had nothing to say until the group decided what narrative to present. Her evolving descriptions may reflect the need to adjust her lines as new information became public. Far from being accidental, these inconsistencies may be the fingerprints of invention. The implications of this theory are stark. If true, it would mean that one of the most famous child abduction cases in modern history was not an abduction at all, but a carefully staged deception. It would mean that the central witness, Jane Tanner, did not misremember but missold, whether out of loyalty, fear, or shared guilt. And it would mean that the Tapas Seven were not simply bystanders but participants in a cover-up, bound together by a silent pact to protect two grieving parents from the consequences of a fatal mistake. To some, this hypothesis remains too dark, too conspiratorial. Yet the longer one studies the testimonies, the harder it becomes to dismiss the sense of artifice. Stories align too perfectly, timelines dovetail too smoothly, and the abductor's appearance materializes only when it is most needed. For critics, it is not chaos that raises suspicion, but the very neatness of the tale. Real life, messy and unpredictable, rarely produces such symmetry. A script, however, does. In the end, whether or not this hypothesis is true, it highlights the enduring mystery of Jane Tanner's role. Was she a lone observer, unlucky enough to see what no one else did? Or was she the indispensable narrator of a story crafted to protect her friends? The possibility that her words were not just unreliable, but deliberately designed forces us to reconsider the entire case. For if her testimony was part of a play, then the world has been watching not a tragedy, but a performance staged to hide a deeper truth. In the unfolding mystery of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, two witness accounts stand out as the most discussed and the most contested: the so-called Tanner sighting at 9:15 p.m. and the Smith sighting at around 10 p.m. On the surface, the two descriptions share striking similarities. Both involve an adult male carrying a small child dressed in light sleepwear, barefoot, moving through the streets of Praia da Luz on the night Madeleine vanished. Yet beneath these similarities lie profound differences that shaped the trajectory of the investigation, influenced public perception, and revealed the power of narrative in high-profile cases. Jane Tanner's testimony was the first to emerge. She claimed that while returning from her apartment around 9:15, she saw a man carrying a young girl in pale pajamas. The image she painted was evocative but vague: a slim figure, dark clothes, a child with bare feet and pale garments. It was a fleeting glimpse, yet it became the linchpin of the abduction theory. Placed neatly into the timeline between Jerry McCann's check at 9:05 and Kate's discovery of Madeleine missing at 10, Tanner's words created the dramatic suggestion that the child had been removed by a stranger within that critical window. By contrast, Martin Smith and several members of his family encountered their sighting at around 10 p.m. They were returning to their apartment when they noticed a man carrying a child along a quiet street near the church. Like Tanner, the Smiths described a girl of about 4 years old, barefoot, in light pajamas. But unlike Tanner, the Smith family provided a more robust collective observation. Multiple adults and even children in their group saw the same figure, noting details such as the man's appearance, his awkward way of carrying the child, and the direction he was heading. Their account was not the impression of a single witness, but the shared experience of several. The critical divergence came later. Months after the disappearance, Martin Smith stated that the man he saw reminded him strongly of Jerry McCann himself. He emphasized that he could not be certain, but the resemblance struck him. This detail transformed the Smith sighting into a deeply problematic piece of evidence. If true, it suggested that the McCann's alibi might not be as airtight as portrayed. It raised the possibility that Jerry himself had been seen carrying Madeleine away around 10, close to the time Kate raised the alarm. In terms of similarity, both sightings presented the haunting image of a child being carried away in the night, a vision that resonated emotionally and reinforced the idea of abduction. Both described light sleepwear and bare feet, details that later became associated with Madeleine's actual clothing. Yet the differences in time, context, and witness credibility are crucial. Tanner's account was solitary, placed conveniently at the precise moment needed to support the abduction theory. Smith's account was corroborated by multiple family members, came later in the evening, and raised uncomfortable questions about the McCanns themselves. Why, then, did the Tanner sighting dominate the headlines while the Smith sighting was largely sidelined? The answer lies in the intersection of media dynamics, national loyalties, and investigative politics. From the very beginning, British media outlets, particularly the tabloids, framed the McCanns as victims of a foreign tragedy. Their coverage leaned heavily on narratives that absolved the parents and emphasized the threat of an external predator. Tanner's sighting fit this narrative perfectly. It conjured the image of a prowler snatching a child, playing directly into the fear and drama that the press thrives upon. Smith's testimony, on the other hand, threatened to destabilize this narrative. To publicize too strongly the suggestion that Jerry McCann might have been the man seen would have cast a shadow over the grieving parents, undermining the very storyline that the British press had adopted. In cases of international resonance, the press often aligns with national identity. To question the McCanns too sharply would have meant turning suspicion inward, challenging the comfort of blaming a faceless outsider. As a result, the Smith sighting, though arguably more credible, received only muted attention. The contrast between the two cases underscores how narrative can eclipse evidence. Tanner's words, though uncorroborated and vague, became the cornerstone of the official abduction timeline, promoted in police appeals, media reconstructions, and even the McCann's own press strategy. Smith's sighting, by contrast, lingered in the shadows, mentioned in reports but rarely emphasized, even when Scotland Yard later suggested that Tanner may have simply seen an innocent tourist carrying his daughter. The centrality of her account in the public imagination had already been secured. Smith's identification, by contrast, remained a footnote, too disruptive to the established narrative, too politically inconvenient to highlight. From an investigative perspective, this imbalance had serious consequences. By elevating Tanner's sighting and minimizing Smith's, the search for Madeleine was funneled in a particular direction, toward an external abductor, away from domestic explanations. Resources, attention, and international appeals all revolved around the 9/15 sighting, even though the 10 sighting arguably had stronger corroboration. In retrospect, This asymmetry may have obscured crucial lines of inquiry, closing doors that should have remained open. The juxtaposition of the two sightings raises unsettling questions. Was Tanner's testimony amplified not because it was stronger, but because it was more useful? Was Smith's testimony ignored not because it lacked merit, but because it threatened to implicate the wrong person? In the court of public opinion, perception often outweighs fact. What the McCann case reveals is that perception can be manufactured, guided by the strategic deployment or suppression of certain witnesses. In the end, the Tanner sighting and the Smith sighting are less about what was seen than about what was believed. One vision became a cornerstone of the abduction story. The other, a disruptive alternative, was left on the margins. Together, they demonstrate not only the fragility of eyewitness testimony, but also the power of narrative framing in shaping the world's understanding of a mystery. The haunting image of a man carrying a barefoot child may forever define the night of May 3, 2007. But whether that man was a stranger, a tourist, or even Jerry McCann himself remains one of the most troubling uncertainties of the entire case. The night of May 3, 2007 ended in confusion and despair, but Jane Tanner's words would continue to echo far beyond the streets of Praia da Luz. What she claimed to have seen, a shadowy figure carrying a barefoot child, did not just shape the immediate investigation, it cast a long shadow over the international narrative of the Madeleine McCann case. In the United Kingdom, Tanner's account rapidly became the centerpiece of the public understanding of the case. Newspapers seized on her image of the man with the child, splashing it across front pages as though it were the key to solving the mystery. For many Britons, especially in the early days, Tanner was not simply a bystander but a witness to the abduction itself. Her description fueled appeals, inspired fits, and kept alive the belief that Madeleine had been stolen by an outsider rather than harmed at home. This narrative resonated with a public eager to believe in rescue rather than tragedy. Yet as the months turned into years, cracks began to appear. Online forums, blogs, and later social media platforms developed entire subcultures devoted to scrutinizing every aspect of the case. Among these communities, Tanner's sighting became a lightning rod. For some, she remained the crucial eyewitness, the one person brave enough to step forward and describe the abductor. For others, however, she became the very embodiment of the case's inconsistencies. How could it be that only she, out of all the people on the street that night, noticed such a scene? Why did her details change over time? Why did her account so conveniently support the McCann's timeline? On message boards, such as the McCann Files, or later on platforms like Reddit, and users debated Tanner's credibility with the intensity usually reserved for political or religious disputes. To supporters, she was vilified unfairly, a victim of armchair detectives who underestimated the fallibility of memory. To detractors, she was not just mistaken but complicit, part of what they saw as a deliberate attempt to shield the McCanns from blame. In this way, Tanner became both a symbol of truth and of deception, her name synonymous with the larger question of whether the official narrative could be trusted. The international dimension of these debates only deepened the rift. This national divide reinforced the broader tension between the Portuguese investigation and the British media campaign, with Tanner caught in the middle as both witness and controversy. Her role did not end with the initial investigation. Over the years, Tanner has been a recurring figure in documentaries, investigative programs, and books about the McCann case. Each retelling has positioned her differently. Some documentaries frame her as a pivotal witness, whose account holds the key to the abduction theory. Others, especially those influenced by Goncalo Amaral's perspective, present her as an unreliable narrator whose testimony distracted from more probable explanations. In the court of public opinion, these portrayals have hardened rather than resolved divisions. Every anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance brings a surge of renewed discussion, and with it, fresh debate about Tanner. Some posts repeat her original description, as though it were unshakable evidence. Others mock her, suggesting she invented the sighting under pressure or collusion. In the age of memes and viral commentary, Tanner has become almost archetypal, the witness who saw what no one else did, whose story may have saved or sabotaged the investigation. The psychological weight of this legacy should not be underestimated. While Tanner herself has remained largely private, avoiding the spotlight compared to the McCanns, her name is indelibly linked to one of the most scrutinized criminal cases of the century. Every article, every new documentary, every social media thread about the McCann case inevitably circles back to her, revisiting the same questions. Was she truthful? Was she mistaken? Or was she complicit in something far larger? The long-term consequences of Tanner's testimony are twofold. On one hand, her words kept the abduction theory alive, sustaining international sympathy and fueling an unprecedented media campaign that raised millions in donations for the McCann's legal and investigative efforts. On the other, her testimony fractured public trust, giving rise to conspiracy theories and deep skepticism about the group's credibility. For many, Tanner represents either the fragile hope of an eyewitness or the enduring suspicion of a cover-up. Ultimately, Jane Tanner's legacy in this case is not just about what she saw or did not see on that May night in Portugal. It is about the role a single testimony can play in shaping narratives, mobilizing media, dividing public opinion, and defining the memory of a global mystery. Her sighting remains both a beacon and a shadow, a beacon for those who believe she witnessed the truth, and a shadow for those who believe she helped obscure it. The consequences of her words are still unfolding, a reminder that in cases like this, the testimony of one person can reverberate for decades. The story of Jane Tanner reminds us how powerful a single voice can be. One person's words can shape the direction of an investigation, change how millions of people think, and even decide whether a family is seen as guilty or innocent. That is why her role in the Madeleine McCann case still matters today, not only as part of a mystery, but as a lesson for all of us. The first lesson is simple: memory is fragile. What we see is not always what happened. In moments of stress or confusion, people can misinterpret details, add things later, or even believe something that was never there. This doesn't always mean they are lying. It means the human mind is imperfect. That is why investigators should never depend too much on one witness. A case must be built on strong evidence, not just memory. The second lesson is about pressure. When a child goes missing, the entire community and the media want answers fast. In that rush, witnesses can feel forced to provide certainty. Their words can then be treated like unshakable truth, even when those words are unclear. Tanner's testimony was quickly turned into proof of abduction, and because of that, other possibilities were ignored. This shows us how dangerous it is to build a whole story on a single statement. The third lesson is responsibility. Witnesses are human, but police, journalists, and the public must take extra care. Every word has consequences. A rushed assumption can waste months of investigation. A repeated detail in the media can become fact, even if it is wrong. The price is high, time lost, trust broken, and justice delayed. What does this mean for us today? It means we must stay alert. We must question things, even if they sound convincing. We must remind ourselves that no case is solved by headlines alone. And we must remember that every missing child deserves more than stories, they deserve the truth. The call to action is clear. If you see something, speak honestly and immediately. If you hear something, do not repeat it without care. If you read something, ask yourself whether it is supported by real evidence. These small acts of responsibility could be the difference between finding the truth and losing it forever. Jane Tanner's role will always remain controversial. Some believe she saw the kidnapper. Others believe she was part of a cover-up. But beyond these debates lies the real message: one person's words can guide or misguide an entire search. That power should never be taken lightly. If Tanner saw nothing at all, then the Madeleine McCann case has been carried forward by a story that was never real. And if that is true, the lesson is sharp. Never let comfort replace accuracy, and never let a single voice silence the search for truth. Because when a child disappears, nothing matters more than finding what really happened.